This podcast may contain graphic and potentially upsetting content related to true crime and the paranormal. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod, and this is the Monday Night Review. Welcome to episode 148 of the Monday Night Review. I do hope you're well. I am sitting here having just come back from one shift with the horses, about to go and have another shift with the horses, and I smell in a way that I'm aware that I smell, but if you like horses, you don't really mind the smell. But I think it's just as well we're doing a podcast and not smell-o-vision, just for those of you who are not animal-minded. It's been Halloween. It's been my eldest's 12th birthday. Those of you who have listened to PG episodes will be familiar with him. He's just turned 12. He actually, for his main present, got the Lego Himeji Castle, the Japanese haunted castle I talk about in the Haunted Castles episode part 1. We also had a little mother-son road trip last week, which is why there was no episode. He and I went and saw my bestie who lives in Dorset, and she has my goddaughter. She's keeper of my goddaughter, and we went and hung out in Bridport, and there's a bookshop that we were perusing, and he found a really good book. Actually, I'm going to share it in the links below if I remember, because it's a really good book for any kids. I mean, I say kids. I'm really looking forward to reading it. About weird creatures and oni and sort of weird myths and stuff from around the world. I think it's new. I think it would be a good Christmas purchase if you have godchildren or sons or daughters or anyone who's into that weird kind of thing. I also found a book about urban legends that I've put on my wish list. So I'll share both of those below for you to have a look at. Always good to have gift ideas, I think. And actually, I think I might get it for one of my godsons for his Christmas present. So yes, it was very nice. We listened to spooky podcasts all the way down and had a lovely time. I'm also hoping he's going to get inspired to do another PG episode from his new book. So for those of you who are a fan of Ned as the podcaster, keep your fingers crossed. Right, today we are back on the tubes. We haven't been on the tubes for a while, and I admit that this is my own fault. One of the first places I lived in London after university, I lived in London in my gap year in North London. And then after university, I moved in, and it's actually where I met my husband, in an area called Barons Court in West London. And I bloody love Barons Court. Lots of people would find it very boring, but I really loved it because it had a sort of, I don't know, it kind of isn't very busy, which I really like. But it's just a very nice place to live. And when I was doing research for the podcast, in the very early days of the podcast, I remember finding a really good crime or haunting. And it took place in Barons Court, and I thought, oh my God, when I go on the tubes, this is amazing. And do you remember were you a listener when my old computer died? The original list was on that computer, and I didn't get it back. So not only did I have the perfect crime for one of my favourite places in London, it then died on that computer, and I have not been able to track it down. And we are at Barons Court, and I didn't have a good enough story. And the story that is sort of not famous, but the one that comes up is you either get a very old one about the murder of a policeman, which is kind of cut and dried, or you get a lot of, unfortunately, more recent gang-related crime. But today's story is really interesting. It kept coming up. The victim in today's story is from Fulham Palace area of Hammersmith, which butts onto Barons Court. It's a sort of blurred divide, so I'm counting it as her being from Barons Court. But I thought I knew the story, so I kept looking at it and thinking, well, I can imagine this story. And you know those things where you see a picture and you read perhaps a newspaper headline or something like that, and you think, you make the rest of the story up in your head. I'm sure we're all guilty of it. And the more I read about this, because it kept coming up and I kept thinking, Oh, I'm sure there's, a lot to be said about social problems in this country and other countries in the world. But in fact, there was a lot more to this story. And the story that I'd written in my head is not at all related to the story I'm about to tell you, which is what happened to Joyce Carol Vincent. The sources today are Wikipedia, obviously. There's lots of interesting stuff on Reddit. There's a documentary called Dreams of a Life, which actually I watched, and it has really stuck with me. I don't think it's particularly well done in terms of production value. One problem I had is that they don't have names up, so you never know who the talking heads are. And with most of them, I could find them by Googling them, but then you're kind of Googling people whilst trying to watch this documentary. But if you find this episode interesting, I really recommend watching the documentary, just because it's all people who knew her. And I always find that interesting to, especially with unsolved cases, to speak to and hear from people who knew the victim. So Joyce Carol Vincent was born on the 19th of October 1965 in Hammersmith, London. But as I said, she is off the Fulham Palace Road. I'm counting it as Barron's Court. Her parents are Caribbean immigrants. She is raised in a family of 5 sisters. And her early life is marked by hardships, including an allegedly difficult relationship with her father. And the death of her mother when she was 11 years old, her father doesn't deal with this very well. He's kind of absent. She calls him pork pie because he was this sort of businessman who wore a pork pie hat. She seems to have had a very difficult relationship with him. And she's sort of raised by her sisters. And one thing that I found very interesting here is you often hear about people who are raised by siblings, whether it's because parents are dead or absent or because of life circumstances, meaning that perhaps a single parent is at work all the time and therefore the siblings have to step into a more parental role. But I think here what I found very obvious, and I think we think in terms of like losing that parental love that cannot be replaced by a sibling. And I think it's really sad when family lines get blurred, where grandparents have to bring up grandchildren and they lose the grandparent, that because the grandparent has to become the parent, or siblings have to step into parental roles, and you actually need the sibling to be able to be a sibling. But here I can see certain behaviours that Joyce displayed that were perhaps caused by an absence of a parental figure to learn things from. And we'll go into that in a bit. But Joyce is described by people who knew her as beautiful, charismatic, friendly. She left a positive impression on all friends and colleagues. And that really comes across in the documentary. Now, despite her bright and vibrant personality, Joyce struggled with various challenges. She had health issues, she had bouts of depression, and that may have contributed to what was seen as a sort of gradual withdrawal from her friends and from society. But I don't think it's that clear cut. She's popular in social circles. She dated some high profile men, including musicians, but she'd distanced herself from family and friends over the years. Now, one thing that is very clear, one of the main talking heads in the documentary is a man called Martin, who is her ex-boyfriend. We hear a lot from him, and he met her through work. Joyce seems to be one of those people, and actually one of the people who speaks about her is a man called Alton Edwards, who is a musician, and he basically says, without saying the words, that she has the X factor. She had this magnetism. She was described as happy. She was described as one of those people who quote, when you talk to them, they just lift you. She's always the center of attraction. People wanted to gravitate towards her. She was like a magnet. And so lots of people were talking about her like this, which I find very intriguing. She has a good education. She's sent for elocution lessons, but she passes no exams. And again, her friends are shocked by this because she goes on to work in quite important jobs. She leaves school at 16, goes to secretarial college. She gets a job in the Treasury Department, and she kind of just works her way up. She's very independent. She's, quote, a very well-liked person, and separately, quote, everything about her was immaculate. And it's while she's at one of these jobs that she meets Martin. Martin is her main serious boyfriend, I'd say. She always seems to go back to him. And he says himself and his friends say they're all shocked when he starts dating her. He's a very ordinary looking guy, Martin. He's funny and kind, but she is very beautiful. And she asks him out one day at work. She says, do you want to go for a drink later? And I think that's where it all starts. And he can't kind of believe that she's interested in him. And all his friends love her. But his friends, when they talk about her, are all kind of almost pervy. They talk about, she has these lovely small feet, one of the friends says. They all seem to want to have a crack at her. It seems to be because she's so attractive and magnetic, and because to them she's out of Martin's league, it means that she's fair game. And that really struck me. It seems that Joyce would often be in a friendship group, but flit in and out between friendship groups, be very intense with some people and then disappear. And so the people being interviewed, a lot of the talking heads there seems to be from sort of two groups of friends, one of whom she lived with and one of whom were friends with Martin. And that seems to be the two main groups. And all of them find her very magnetic and beautiful and very independent. And she's very well liked, but she kind of comes and goes. And no one's quite sure when they're next going to see. It could be 6 months. She didn't have lifelong friends. She seemed to really trust Martin, though. And therefore, as an extension of that, his friends. One friend says, quote, Martin was her rock. Whatever happened in her life, she came back to him. And one event that they all talk about is Joyce's 21st party, and it's all Martin's friends there. None of her friends and family are there. And we know that she sort of had this difficult relationship with her West Indian father, who I believe worked as a carpenter. But Martin never met her sisters. She never spoke to her sisters on the phone. She seemed to have lost contact with them. But because she is such a private person and so independent, it could be, a lot of them said it could be that was a 21st party that she had with Martin's friends, and she had another 21st party with her family and different friends. We don't really know. And I find that very interesting. For most of us, it could be that you go out and have dinner with your family and you have a party with your friends, but I don't know that you'd have two completely separate parties, but they just didn't know, they weren't aware, and they just thought, strange that at your 21st, it's Martin and all his friends. She's described as, quote, a bit of a drifter. When she's 24, she moves in with some musicians, and the housemates loved her. They said some visitors would come to the house and think that Joyce was a bit stuck up, but she was, quote, the perfect flatmate, easy to get on with. The worst thing they said about her was she was a bit gross. She left a ring around the bath. quote, she didn't do manual labour. And literally, that's the worst people can say about her who lived with her. And they say it laughing. They literally say it with love. They're like, yeah, she's not going to clean the bathroom. But, they kind of forgive her for it. She's just not someone who does manual labour. It's just not her thing. That's it. That's the worst anyone says about her throughout the whole documentary. And her mother had died, I believe, a few weeks after her 11th birthday. And you sort of wonder, do parents have a big effect on things like friendships, consistency? Was she almost pathologically independent so that she couldn't rely on anyone because she'd grown up not having a mother through the formative years and not having a good relationship with her father and being brought up by her sisters who were older. And so, when she's 11, her sisters are teenagers and older. Is she having to be independent and having to look after herself and having to get on with it a lot of the time? And I wonder if this kind of disappearing from people's lives for 6 months and no one being quite sure where they are, is that something to do with how she was brought up? So one thing that I found very interesting and why I like it when you see friends and family interviewed is you'd hear from the housemates. The housemates are musicians. They have a studio in the garden. They have a mixtape, a demo tape that she's made. They say that she's got a beautiful singing voice. They say that at school she would stand and sing in the playground and people would be drawn to listen to her, and she sort of would entertain everyone. And she, again, the word magnetic is used. So you get this idea that she is this sort of enchanting child with a difficult home life that doesn't do well at school but gets into good jobs where she is immaculately turned out. She does a good job. She makes friends with colleagues. It's where she meets Martin. And she has this beautiful singing voice. Alton Edwards says she had a beautiful singing voice, and she had this demo tape, and she was, friends with all of these musicians. But she had one boyfriend, Alistair Abrams, and I think they went out for 18 months or so, and they lived together, and it seemed that they were quite intense. Now, he says, and he's a musician, that she couldn't sing. He said, I told her she could mouth in the background. Gil Scott-Heron came round to dinner at their flat. She met him. He came home one day and she was chatting on the phone to Isaac Hayes, who had phoned to speak to him. And when he got on the phone to Isaac Hayes, he was like, I don't know why I'm talking to you. I much prefer talking to Joyce. But he said that he found that she had no interests of her own. She adapted her life to her boyfriends. So like when she was with Martin and she became friends with his friends, when she was with Alistair, his life became her life. He comes across as bitter. Martin, either whether it's nervous smiling or whatever, he sort of smiles when he talks about her, and Alistair comes across as very bitter. He says she goes to a speech by Nelson Mandela, and she meets Mandela, and Alistair says, quote, I wanted to meet him all my life, and Joyce met him. And there's a sort of bitterness there of like, so I find he really stood out for me. We've got Joyce. She lives with Alistair for 18 months. She is friends with these musicians. There's a singer called Betty Wright who loved Joyce, thought she was wonderful. And she will then disappear for 6 months at a time and come back. She lives with these musicians. She disappears for some time. At one point, she stays with Martin's friend John, who goes on about how he thought she was gorgeous, and before long she was walking around in her underwear, and tension was building and it was uncomfortable. And then one day he comes home and she's gone and he was relieved. He's, again, there's this sort of undercurrent from Martin's friends of like, she's this thing to have. It's very hard to explain. What we know of her is she's held various jobs, including a position at accounting firm Ernst & Young. But she eventually quit there. She often would just walk out of jobs and leave them. We'll talk about that in a bit. And she moved quite frequently between residences and jobs. She always did good work. As far as we know, she wasn't fired. It would literally be that she would leave the job. And didn't sort of fall out with people. She would just move on. What we know is that at some point, Joyce Carol Vincent moves into a flat in Wood Green above the shopping centre in North London. And this flat is part of a sheltered housing arrangement for women at risk of abuse funded by a charity which provided her with this flat. So we know that she's in a sheltered housing flat and nobody really knows what happens until one day in January 2006, her bills haven't been paid. And they basically send the bailiffs round to start repossessing things and to basically kick her out of the flat. And they break into the flat and inside they find the skeletal remains of Joyce Carol Vincent in front of her television. Her television is still on. Her body is so decomposed that cause of death couldn't be determined. They believe that she died at some point in 2003. There's no indication of foul play. Some have suggested that she has died from complications related to either asthma or a peptic ulcer that she had been to hospital for in 2003 and treated for. In 3 years, Joyce had been upstairs decomposing. The TV had been on the entire time, and nobody had reported her missing. And when I first heard this story of Joyce Carol Vincent and the fact that she was found as a skeleton in her sheltered housing, I assumed young black woman. She was 38 when she died. And I assumed young black woman failed by the system. Traumatic childhood, traumatic life, failed by the system. And that really isn't the story here. That is probably the story for a lot of people, although I think it is unusual to have someone undiscovered for that length of time. I'd like to think in this country. I know it happens a lot more commonly in other countries, but the questions it raises are huge for whoever's found. But the questions that it raises around this once sort of magnetic and dynamic woman is incredible. So the first question is obviously why is it happened? She's in sheltered housing, so that means that she's in some sort of system somewhere. It also implies that she's been escaping an abusive relationship and seeking anonymity. And because that then also raises the question, was foul play involved? Now, she's found watching the television, surrounded by wrapped Christmas presents. Now, because her flat is supported by a charity, her flat's rent and bills continued to be paid through automatic benefit payments and arrears, which accumulated unnoticed for years. So I believe that it was partially paid, and so because it's partially paid, the bit that's not being paid just goes into arrears, and that slipped through somebody's fingers. The television and heating remained on due to her direct debit payments, which masked any signs of neglect. We don't know. I believe it's these that started to bounce, perhaps, and therefore that's when the repossession notices started coming in. And it's only when the housing association sought to properly repossess the property for the unpaid rent that they entered the flat and found her remains. And Joyce's death raised profound questions about the nature of urban life and the potential for individuals to disappear, even if it is one of the world's largest cities. She had become almost invisible. She had no close friends or families aware of what was going on. And the fact that no one noticed her absence for such a prolonged period of time struck many as tragic and disturbing. In 2011, Carol Morley released the documentary Dreams of a Life, which I've been talking about a lot. And it attempted to reconstruct Joyce's life and look at the circumstances leading to her death. They interview former friends, acquaintances, colleagues. The documentary shows this well-liked but deeply private woman. And although there's discussions of urban isolation, mental health, the fragility of social connections, it's very telling. And I love that overall social commentary, and I think it is very important. But for me, there is a puzzle piece missing, and I know that seems very obvious thing to say, but who are these presents being wrapped for? Her, as far as I know, only female housemate that she lived with when she lived with the musicians says that she found it very difficult to comprehend that Joyce would have cut herself off from her sister's kids. She loved her nieces and nephews. And so for her to believe that she's not in contact with them by the time of her death doesn't sit right. One person says of Joyce, everyone has their secrets. She just seemed to have more than most. One person does describe her as being, quote, emotionally retarded. Martin always wondered why she had no contact with her sisters, but it seems that she just wasn't confident letting people in. She didn't like letting people in. Martin said she moved a lot. He always helped her move. So even when they weren't together, he was her person. And he said the moment she thought something wasn't right, she'd move. And that accounted for jobs as well. She walked out for jobs. She wouldn't give a reason. And sometimes it would be because men were pestering her. And rather than dealing with it, she would just leave. So men would pester her to go out with them. And rather than taking it further, she would just leave the job. And I think people did say to her, like, you shouldn't have to leave your job because of this. And she just would. And at one point she goes and she stays with Martin for 6 months, and she sleeps on his sofa, and she gets up every day and she gets immaculately put together and goes to work. But one day he forgets something, and so he goes back to his flat, and she is coming back. And he said it made him wonder whether she was going to work at all, or whether this was just a put on so that he would think that she was going to work. They speak to some colleagues from her last known job, who again talk about how lovely she was. And it just seems that there was this secret private thing going on that no one was really aware of. Some speculate that perhaps she was abused as a child, and this made her in need of creating this sort of great secrecy about some things. He said that she was very trusting of people. And so we have this woman who moves jobs a lot, moves houses a lot. That can be an indicator also of someone trying to avoid an abusive partner. Her female flatmate said that she wouldn't have been surprised. She said men became very possessive of Joyce. She sort of triggered this emotional intensity in them. So to her, the idea that Joyce was fleeing an abusive relationship isn't far-fetched. We also, that would fit with isolating her from her family. We know that abusive and controlling partners aim to do that. And it would seem that she was someone who perhaps was vulnerable to being secluded away from those close to her, because she didn't let anyone get past a certain level of closeness, and because she had this very independent and private desire. We know that in January 1988, police were involved in one incident with her, but they don't tell anyone what it was. So whether that was linked to the same person. We know that she has one abusive boyfriend who would lock her in her flat all day. Whether that's the same as in 1988, whether that is the same person that she is running from. So there are lots of indicators that she was suffering from some form of abuse, whether it is one individual or several, we don't know. We know, obviously, that there can be a pattern. Once someone has suffered some form of abuse, it can happen over again. Her female flatmate saw her in 2001 coming towards her on the street, and she shouted her name, and Joyce wouldn't stop and just looked away and walked straight past her. In March 2001, she left the company she'd been working for 4 years. They were sad to see her go. They were having a leaving party. She said that she was leaving to go travelling. Friends from that job say, quote, "There's part of me that feels uncomfortable about the fact that we never heard from her again." But that happens a lot. You can have these intense sort of friendships with people that you work with, and then one of you leaves and you don't really see them again, or you don't stay in contact. Especially in 2001. I mean, when did everyone start having phones in their pockets? You know, you've also got to bear that in mind. Now, Alistair says that a while before she must have died, so she wanted to get back with him, and he refused. Again, that is according to him. It's in August 2001 that she calls Martin to come and stay on his couch. He says, "Are you in any kind of trouble?" She says no, but she won't tell him why she needs somewhere to stay, and she does end up staying with him for about 6 months until the early new year of 2002. He asks her out again, and she says, quote, "No, I don't want to go back over old ground." So that's why for me, I'm like, oh, but she will get back with Alistair. And Alistair for me is the one that pings out throughout this documentary as being the only person that speaks about her with bitterness. It's very interesting. And it's in 2002 that Martin realizes that perhaps she's not working. And he says that one day he comes home and she's just gone. Now, we know that in 2003, she's taken into hospital for a peptic ulcer. And when she's in the hospital, she's very ill. And they ask her for her next of kin. And she puts her bank manager. And this is very interesting. I would expect for her to put Martin, because she's just been living with him. He's close, but to put your bank manager is very, I don't know, very sad and very sinister. After she's moved out, a letter arrives for her at Martin's address, and it's wages for a cleaning job. And she'd obviously not been going to work in an office. Like she said, she had been going to do this cleaning job. And his feelings were kind of hurt that she hadn't told him this. And everyone was, really surprised. They cannot see her doing this kind of work. And it's hard to know why she would have done it. She obviously was very capable at the office work that she did. She had left saying that she was going travelling. She wasn't. And then she's doing this cleaning job. Again, could this be related to an abusive partner wanting her to do a cleaning job can be quite isolating. You don't necessarily see anyone else, especially if it's commercial cleaning. And nobody really can imagine her being a cleaner. Alistair, the ex-boyfriend, believes she didn't know how to be happy. Quote, she was afraid to live the dream. And he thought she always imagined something would come along and mess it up. Didn't seem able to enjoy things as they were. Quote, she had demons that haunted her. And this is all the strands of a woman who then dies in her flat and is not found for 3 years and is not reported missing. Now, questions I have. And I think their friends feel guilty, but she was very in and out of their lives, and they all very much class themselves as Martin's friends, not her friends. And so I wouldn't expect them to know and to report her missing. But I find it strange that her sisters didn't. She had nieces and nephews. Was there a rift there? Had she burned some bridges? One of Martin's friends said, quote, it's like she never really existed. It's like we made her up, partly because we let her go off and die. She is the epitome of people not checking on their neighbour or their friends. Martin says, quote, I wish she'd rung me because I would have helped, because I love you. And then he breaks down, and he's held it together throughout the whole thing, but you really feel like she was perhaps the love of his life, and he never felt like it was reciprocated, or that she was someone who could be tied down, or I don't know. I don't know whether I'm a fixer. So I like to feel like I'm proactive and can sort things out. Did no one feel like saying to her, I think she had this wall up that you couldn't get behind. So it would have felt intrusive to say to her, look, why are you moving all the time? What is going on? And she had this access to this musician's life. People found her magnetic, and yet it didn't fit right with her. I think she either died of natural causes, peptic ulcer, the asthma attack, or there was foul play. I would be interested to know who the presents were for, because that would imply that she was at least going to have some contact with someone to deliver the presents. Or maybe someone was expecting her for Christmas or to see her. There are, of course, loads of questions raised about how you can be in sheltered housing that's paid for by a charity, but that they're not kind of aware of you, because I would think that a charity for abused women, you would kind of want someone to know that they hadn't been tracked down and had their abuser there. So there are, of course, those questions of, why didn't the neighbours notice the telly? Well, I've lived in London for 20 years. There's a lot of noise. And there are some places where you knock on the wall or you go around and say, can you turn the TV down? There are some places you just don't. You just don't. Don't draw attention to yourself. So the TV noise for me isn't a thing. We also don't know, she probably didn't have it blaringly loud. She's 38. But who was she hiding from? Who had been the abuser? And I wonder if the police know, or if nobody knows. Someone knows. The abuser knows. Why is Alistair Andrews so bitter about people loving her and her not being able to sing when everyone else says she can sing, and people who were at school with her said she can sing. And throughout the documentary, people say they didn't associate, because there's no photo shown. When they announce this woman is found, the skeleton of a woman is found. Joyce Carol Vincent is quite a distinctive name, but nobody associated the woman in the story with the woman they knew. And everybody in the documentary who knew her said, when I read the story, that was not the Joyce Carol Vincent I knew. The Joyce Carol Vincent I knew would not have died alone in her flat and been left unnoticed for 3 years, in this sheltered housing flat in Wood Green. It's just not, it just doesn't fit. And I just feel like there are so many unanswered questions. And I don't feel like Martin's friends, should have been the people phoning to check up on her. I've been married for 15 years. I wouldn't expect my husband's friends to be phoning me to check up on me. But I would be interested to know this, and I'm not blaming anyone. It's a terrible thing that's happened, but I want to know the situation with her sister. There is massive signs of an abusive relationship here, where she's running from something. She doesn't seem able to deal with confrontation. She seems to create this sort of obsessive thing in men. I think it's incredibly interesting how the men talk about her, how beautiful she was. Oh my God, she's absolutely beautiful. She has Martin punches one of his friends because one of his friends snogs or has sex with Joyce, and after they've broken up, it doesn't seem to be this. As I said, there doesn't normally, and I know that this is a generalization, if your friend has a partner that is off bounds, right? And there will always be people that don't go for this. But what I found so interesting was that every man felt they could have a go, or they wanted to. And that was fair game. And I think that's very intriguing, because it gives you a real insight into what she was like, this magnetic, beautiful woman that men just felt they needed to have. But they all say, we didn't really know her. She didn't have any of her own hobbies. She just absorbed into the life of her boyfriends. She didn't. It's such an interesting insight into this personality, but into what she created. So it must have been very difficult to live with men behaving like this. And I can see how an abusive man would latch onto this person who easily absorbs into other people's lives and has this privacy barrier. I just find the whole story really intriguing. And of course, there's this, a lot to be said about isolation and, connection and community and, all of that. But I'm sure she died. I'd say I'm 80% sure she died of natural causes. But that 20%, did they find, was her hyoid bone? I'm assuming her hyoid bone was intact. I'm assuming that there was no evidence of blunt force trauma on her skull. I mean, I know that her body is too badly decomposed to find cause of death, but you must be able to rule out some things from looking at her skeleton. And I would think that if she died from an abusive attack, that would involve possibly strangulation, which the higher bone can show you, or there was obviously, without wanting to be too gross, she'd melted into the carpet essentially, and the flooring, but there's no evidence of blood anywhere else, which does that kind of rule out beating and stabbing. She's watching telly, so that doesn't imply that she's struggling, but was she placed there? There are just there's enough questions for me to feel uneasy about this. I mean, a woman with ill health dies and isn't found is terrible and horrible, and definitely needs thinking about, and it shows you that community and checking in on your friends and your neighbours and everything is really important. But for me, the social, the personal aspect of Joyce Carol Vincent is just intriguing. What was the secret life that we don't know about, that nobody knows about, except for those players? Because she kept everything so separate. And that is the incredibly mysterious story of the life and death of Joyce Carol Vincent. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. As always, I'll put any images that are relevant up on our social media at themondaynighreview@gmail.com. I am currently wearing a long sleeve t-shirt. Oh, I haven't put the long sleeve t-shirts up, but I'm currently wearing a long sleeve t-shirt. And it's super soft and comfy, and I love it. So I will try and put them up ASAP. But yeah, they're soft, ethical, lovely t-shirts made and printed in the UK. So check that out. You can email me themondaynighreview@gmail.com. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.